Salutations, respected viewers. This is George from Ireland. I'm continuing my series about the history of the Soviet Union for A-level. So I'm looking at the stabilisation of the Soviet Union in the 1920s. So the Russian Civil War ended in roughly 1922. That was, of course, the year that the Soviet Union was founded as such. The country was wrecked because there had been 8 years of war and upheaval. Pestilence stalked the blighted land because there was almost no medical care and people were not living in proper houses in some cases. Many people were malnourished. Hospitals had largely ceased to function. Only gradually were medical services re-established. So hospitals had been bombed, had been burnt, looted, neglected. Many medical staff had scarpered. There was little medical equipment that was functional. Very few drugs were available. So the USSR didn't have the wherewithal to purchase medicines abroad and found it very difficult to manufacture them. So you could hardly get medicines for love or money. So the country had precious little by the way of foreign exchange. So how were they to buy the needfuls? And the Russian ruble was not very valuable at the time. So, or the Soviet ruble, perhaps I should say, very few of its manufactures or even its raw materials were sold abroad. There had been a decade of destruction and slaughter, which had set the Soviet Union back 20 years, I suppose. So it was to take some time to climb out of this hole. But towards the end of the Civil War, people had wanted it over at almost any price. They were just exhausted by years of bloody turmoil. They wanted it to end, and in some cases didn't care who won, so long as the maelstrom was over. There was near starvation going on in the cities. It's been the case for some time. Peasants had little incentive to sell their produce since there were very few manufactured goods to purchase, and the official price was so low as to be unattractive. So how were urbanites to get their comestibles? Well, the Red Army had people go out into the countryside requisitioning, which was taking at gunpoint. Black marketeering had been severely penalised. Excess grain was normally turned into vodka. Actually, alcohol was outlawed in the Russian Empire at the outbreak of the First World War, and that was still on the statute books. So what would the average farmer wish to buy? What would he want to afford? So that's why the Red Army had its platoons sequestering food in the countryside. Very little was forthcoming voluntarily, so they had to threaten to punish people. It seemed like armed robbery, but how were these cities to survive? But anyway, it was the peasants tended to perceive it as armed robbery. A law was promulgated that anyone who informed a grain hoarder would be rewarded with some of that grain for himself. This yielded some positive results, but nowhere near enough. Peasants would hand over their grain, imploring the Red Army to believe that these were the last scraps they had. Sometimes peasants were making that claim truthfully. Eventually, most of the top leaders of the USSR were obliged to recognize reality. Coercing the peasantry into producing and handing over food was simply unworkable. How could the state make it worthwhile for peasants to produce more and then to sell it? Well, that had to be on the open market, a higher price. How much higher? Well, let the market decide. You can't buck the market, as Margaret Thatcher was to say. Therefore, the new economic policy was introduced, or really to be called the old economic policy. There was an almighty row within the Communist Party as to whether this was the right to do. Some people said, no, it's an act of turpitude. It's a return to capitalism. It's a betrayal of the cause of the workers, and it would entrench the exploitation which is inherent in capitalism. The peasants who do not willingly hand over their food to us are petty bourgeois and must be punished as enemies of the people. Well, coercion only works to a certain extent. Lenin argued for the NAP, so he was quite flexible. The CPSU sometimes had to do things which flew in the face of communism. The CPSU had held its nose and agreed to the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918, thereby pulling Russia out of the First World War. It had been absolutely vital to saving the revolution. As Lenin had said at the time, our hands must be absolutely free to fight the bourgeoisie in our own country. So too the NEP was needed so that the revolution would survive and to end the ongoing starvation of the Soviet people. And it did arrest the decline into starvation. It was not just the food supply that would be altered, but all forms of production and service. With difficulty, Lenin coaxed the CPS unit to vote for the NEP. Within months, it was beginning to bear fruit. So the NEP members that were known would go out to the villages, purchase food, bring it back to the cities, sell it at a handsome profit, and this money fructified in their pockets, and a little bit of luxury returned to the country. NEP men were making goods appear in shops and getting services functioning again in a way that the state couldn't. It was extraordinary that the private enterprise was more effectual in moving goods around the country than the state was. The USSR decided to capitalize on its artistic heritage. Wealthy foreign capitalists were invited to the Soviet Union to view and purchase treasures that had belonged to the Tsar and to the nobility. This provided some desperately needed hard currency at a time when the ruble was all but worthless abroad. So many foreign art collectors were fellow travellers, champagne socialists, if ever there were them. They lived in opulence whilst they espoused egalitarianism, and of course they weren't handing over their readies to those who were really needy, were not unless they got some chinoiserie in exchange. They were not grossly hypocritical, these people who espoused communism, but they were very capitalistic themselves. Some people who bought these things were mere profiteers, others were collectors of objets d'art. So rather than let these works gather dust when they were left in the hands of the unappreciative, better to display them in galleries. Well, they could have been displayed in galleries in the Soviet Union. So the USSR made efforts to abolish illiteracy, and these were highly successful. The USSR wanted to be recognised by the country so they wouldn't attack. The United Kingdom re-established diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union. It was blatant that communists were here to stay. The first Labour government did that in 1923. The peak in refusing to recognise that the communists really were the government had been silly. Anyway, there were also lucrative business opportunities, and these were to be had for the asking in the Soviet Union. So British commerce pushed for recognition. The Soviet Union also needed to purchase equipment abroad to rebuild its industrial base. Anyway, 1922, Lenin had his first stroke. He had to recuperate in the countryside, living in an area now called Gorky, which is somewhere out to the west of Moscow. He was a good friend of Maxim Gorky, who was sympathetic to the revolution, not actually Bolshevik, and indeed had interceded in favour of other leftists, non-Bolshevik leftists who were imprisoned by Lenin. So Lenin had a soft spot for Gorky and sometimes acceded to his requests. Most Soviet citizens' healthcare was almost non-existent in the 20s. There was such a severe paucity of medical staff, drugs and apparatus, as I previously outlined. But the apparatchiki were the new aristocracy, and nothing was too expensive for them. They would not let their egalitarian platitudes get in the way of obtaining the very finest care for themselves. But Soviet medical care was seldom good enough for these tribunes of the people. The Politburo would often vote its members some weeks of a rest cure in a most estimable and pricey spa or sanatorium in Germany or Switzerland. These top communist officials drew modest salaries, but everything was provided them by the state: clothes, food, housing, and so on. The Politburo would even vote them extra cash payments from time to time. So the press, the stage, and books were severely censored. Remember, the theatre was much more important back then. No television, no radio even, in the early 20s in the Soviet Union. All forms of artistic expression and information were supposed to glorify the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Marx was to be on a pedestal, often literally, and statues of him were put all around the Soviet Union. The role of the media was to be a Lenin mouthpiece and to denigrate the enemies of communism. Writers extolled the manifold virtues of the Red Army and spoke of the revolution as the most blessed liberation. There were plaudits and material rewards for authors who were willing to toe the party line, fat salaries, and dowries into desirable locations. Lenin, in view of his condition, was contemplating posterity. Ever the realist, he was aware that he may soon be summoned to the great big Politburo in the sky. He drew up his last will and testament. Who would come after him? He did not nominate an heir. He didn't see a decent person to fill his shoes. He also had no desire to weaken his position in the interim. Perhaps he thought there ought to be a collective leadership. Well, he should have said so if that was it. He wrote most scathingly of Josif Vissarionovich Djugashvili, known by his sobriquet Stalin. His words on Trotsky were also acerbic. Stalin, he said, was too rude and must not have the paramount position. Didn't want Trotsky to have pole position either. Lenin recovered from semi-paralysis in 1923, but never fully. He was on a bath chair in the summer of 1923. There's a famous photo of him sitting beside Stalin. Many people thought it was a doctored one, made up in the Stalin era when all sorts of false images were published, but it's been examined and it is authentic. In January 1924, Lenin suffered cerebral arteriosclerosis and died. That's a blood vessel in the brain bursting. The sclerosis was the stiffness of the artery which caused it to burst.